Ladies and gentlemen, today we saw a side proposition team who, while tried to convince you that China would progress because it's moving into a research industry, fails to recognize the fact that cheap labor is actually systemic and inherent to China's economy. So first I'm going to go with some clash and disprove their three contentions. I'd like to rebuild the opposition case, and then move on to our final argument, that of multipolarity. So let's begin by examining the proposition case and why it's flawed. So the first argument was that of the economy. And so my partner pointed out that in China, 43% of their GDP is from the manufacturing industry, and that this isn't a coincidence. The fact is, cheap labor has become systemic. It's inherent to China, that pretty much everyone works in a big sweatshop, in a big factory, that there isn't really this urbanized life that we enjoy in our society here. And the problem with this is that they tried to make a comparison to, say, Britain back in the 20th century. But at the time, Britain was still fairly small compared to what China is today. They had a few million people, not a few billion people. And so transitioning a few million people from a manufacturing world into that of more of a research-based economy is significantly easier than getting a few billion people to transition from manufacturing industry into that of a research industry. So we think that the cheap labor that they seem to be opposed to is actually inherent to China's economy. What we've also shown is that the growth rate of China's economy is in fact slowing down. Now they brought up a few subpoints in their case, and I'd like to deal with these. First, they talked about culture and hard work in China. But the fact is, as we've shown you, that cheap labor is quite inherent to China's economy, and so menial labor is what most people do. So while Chinese people might be hardworking, if all they're doing every day is basically working in a factory, then their hard work's not going to pay off. Alright, so then they address this idea that the government's actually efficient, and we find this quite ludicrous because the Chinese government, it's communist, it's socialist. It's based on this huge bureaucracy that controls the lives of people. We don't think a system like this can actually be efficient when the government's controlling all our lives. No, thank you. Alright, they talked about education, and my partner showed you that, well, Chinese education is actually based quite on memorization, on rote, and so there's not actually a whole ton of innovation. Well, let's move on to their next argument, this idea of patents. Well, they told us that, China has a lot more patents. Well, at the end of the day, many of these patents aren't actually effective. China doesn't actually produce anything of its own. It's not actually innovative. It's not actually inventing anything. In fact, a lot of these patents are just imitations of products from the West. We see that in China there's a huge industry made from fake products. It's imitated. It's not something that Chinese people have thought of on their own. So we don't think that these patents actually reflect innovation in China. But furthermore, we've also shown you the analysis behind this, that because China's government is one that censors the people, that there's actually not a lot of progress that can be made. And furthermore, my partner did prove to you that because of the one-child policy, the Chinese population is in fact shrinking. And we're going to go into a time period in which the working class is quite a bit smaller than the elderly class, and therefore we see an economy that's completely unsustainable. Their second argument, that of influence. And so they told us that, well, China has influence because it is money. But we've already disproved their first argument on economics, so we think that by extension this argument and this logical analysis also falls. They told us that, well, China has economic reliance and other countries are reliant upon China. But this idea of trade and reliance is a two-way relationship. For example, China holds US bonds, but in return US is Chinese money. So we think that US actually exerts more of a control over China than China does the US. This economic reliance is a dependency between two nations. It's not like everyone has to look up to China. No, China has to ensure the well-being of everyone else as well. They also talked about how China has influence because it has a lot of consumers. It can buy a lot of stuff. But we've shown you that because China's going to have a decreasing population, it's actually going to have less consumption and therefore less influence. Yes?
Would you not agree that the buying power per capita would increase even if the population were to decrease, still having a large consumer base?
No, absolutely not. We don't think that people are going to get richer because of the fact that people still are going to be taking up cheap labor jobs, because that's inherent to the Chinese economy. And so let's move on to the third argument, this idea of stagnation. And so they told us that, the West is falling. But the fact is, China can't actually let the West fall, because China's economy, as they themselves said, is quite dependent upon the economies of other countries. So if the US falls, then China goes down with it. Why is this? Well, China owns $1 trillion of US debt. So if US suddenly defaults on this debt, then China gets none of it. So China can't afford to let the rest of the nations fall because it's so dependent on them. So we don't think this principle of stagnation actually applies. In fact, China's currency is even pegged onto the US dollar, showing how interdependent they are. And so then they pointed out that, other countries are falling, such as Russia, India, Brazil. And guess who they forgot rather? They forgot the United States of America, which we think is actually quite an important factor. And so unless they can prove that the US is going to fall and sink below China, we don't think that these examples are even relevant. A tiny bit of rebuilding. On our first argument of foreign agenda, they said that China is looking out for its own needs. And we think that this stubbornness that China is presenting, that it's only looking out for itself, vetoing resolutions to help other nations like Syria, is actually causing China to lose a lot of friends and international prestige. So we don't think that's a good thing for China. Secondly, our analysis of economics, they told you that the US has a debt problem and that their debt ceiling is really high, and that's why there's less foreign direct investment. That didn't actually address our analysis that, no, it's because of China's poor human rights records that the US is placing sanctions on China. That's what's causing foreign direct investment to fall. All right, so now that I've sufficiently dealt with what's happened so far, let's move on to the third and final argument on side opposition, this idea of multipolarity. So multipolarity describes a world in which power is divided between several nations. Our increasingly globalized world has created an international community in which all countries are economically, politically, and militarily interdependent. And it's under these three lenses that I'm going to examine this concept of multipolarity. Firstly, this idea of economic multipolarity. So we posit that no single country, including China, has the ability to own the 21st century economically simply because the economies are so dependent upon one another in the 21st century. So China's economy is extremely dependent on imports, exports, and foreign direct investment, which accounts for a large amount of their gross domestic product. And the loss of these investments will therefore cripple the Chinese economy because it plays such a huge role. My partner has proven to you how this is already happening with foreign direct investment decreasing. So we've proven that China's economy is unsustainable, but why else will corporations pull their operations from China? Well, it's because globalization has allowed money to leave China and go to other countries. As soon as the Chinese economy grows to the extent where demand exceeds supply and further growth is not feasible, investment will simply leave China and move to other areas where labor is cheaper. So in a multipolar world, there are limits to the extent to which one economy can expand because people can choose to invest in whatever country they want and because economies are so interdependent. Now, the second idea of political multipolarity. So multipolarity has also ensured that no single country can dominate global politics because power is distributed amongst several different nations. So any political decision from one nation requires the support of others. For example, let's say in the UN General Assembly, China just has one vote out of 193 votes. So their voice on the political stage isn't actually that huge. But furthermore, we'd say that all major superpowers are actually in a political stalemate. No country, including China, can own the 21st century politically because we have to deal with the problems of all nations because the nations are so interconnected. And finally, this idea of military multipolarity. The concept that no single military is strong enough to defeat an alliance of other militaries. The way our world works now is that countries have formed allies with one another. Countries are allied together. So even if China's military is huge, it can effectively deal with the rest of the world. So what have I gone over in the speech today? Well, what I've shown you is that the economy within China isn't actually as strong as that proposition we want you to believe, that it's actually systemic for them to have cheap labor due to their size. We've shown you that China's influence is dwindling on the global stage, and that it's not going to be the owner of the 21st century. Thank you.